Beverly Hills has always sold itself as a dream, a place where the streets shimmer in the California sun, palm trees sway over gleaming mansions, and limousines glide past perfectly manicured lawns. In the golden age of Hollywood, this wasn't just a city, it was a stage. Here, the biggest stars mingled with the wealthiest studio moguls, sipping champagne behind wrought iron gates and under chandeliers worth more than the average home. But if you knew where to look, past the velvet ropes and beyond the polished smiles, you'd see a different kind of royalty roaming these streets, the kind who didn't care about Oscars or premieres, because they already owned the people who made them. Organized crime had learned long before Beverly Hills became a celebrity haven that appearances were everything. If you looked rich and respectable, no one asked where your money came from. And in the 1930s and 40s, as fortunes from prohibition bootlegging, gambling rings, and illicit rackets piled up, mob bosses went shopping. Not for nightclubs or casinos, but for luxury California real estate. They weren't just buying houses, they were buying legitimacy. A mansion in Beverly Hills didn't just give you a swimming pool and a famous neighbor, it gave you an alibi. By day, mobsters blended seamlessly into the Beverly Hills elite, hosting charity luncheons and rubbing shoulders with silver screen icons. By night, those same homes turned into command centers, places where gambling profits from Las Vegas could be washed clean through studio investments, and where a whispered conversation in a marble-tiled study could change the fate of an entire film production. The beauty of Beverly Hills was its camouflage. The city's glittering facade made it nearly impossible for the average person, or even the press, to imagine that beneath the perfume and champagne, briefcases stuffed with cash were being traded just as often as autographs. It was the perfect front, a paradise where the mob could hide in plain sight. And that paradise was only just getting started. The next step in their plan was to turn Beverly Hills from a luxury neighborhood into their personal empire. And it began with the city's very creation. In the early 1900s, Beverly Hills was little more than a dusty patch of farmland wedged between Los Angeles and the Pacific coast. Developers dreamed of turning it into a wealthy enclave, but the area needed more than just palm trees and sunshine. It needed prestige. By the 1920s, Hollywood's rising stars began moving in, drawn to the privacy, custom-built mansions, and the promise of escaping the chaos of central Los Angeles. That's when the mob saw its opening. To most, the city's growth looked like the natural byproduct of movie money flowing in. But behind the scenes, organized crime figures were quietly scooping up prime parcels of land, sometimes through shell companies, sometimes through legitimate investors who owed them favors. Their logic was simple: control the land, control the neighborhood. And in Beverly Hills, the neighbors weren't just anyone. They were the faces that sold tickets around the world. Mob bosses like Bugsy Siegel, already knee-deep in Las Vegas ventures, recognized Beverly Hills as the ideal West Coast base. It was close enough to the studios to make deals, but far enough from downtown Los Angeles law enforcement to feel untouchable. It also offered something the mob valued above all else: image. Hosting parties in lavish Beverly Hills mansions didn't just impress the movie crowd, it gave mobsters the appearance of being respectable businessmen. As more stars moved in, from silent film legends to emerging talkie idols, the mob leveraged those connections. Studio moguls found themselves invited to exclusive dinners where mob money was subtly offered as production financing. Actors who got in too deep at the mob's private poker games discovered that their debts could be forgiven if they agreed to certain roles or endorsements. Even city officials were not immune. Campaign contributions flowed freely to those willing to look the other way on zoning laws or property transfers. By the end of the 1930s, Beverly Hills wasn't just a glamorous neighborhood, it was a chessboard. The mob controlled key properties, influenced the guest lists at high-profile events, and had their hooks in enough powerful people to keep the city's public image squeaky clean. But this wasn't just about real estate or reputation. The real money came when the mob used Beverly Hills as the front line for their most profitable West Coast operation, laundering millions through the film industry itself. From the outside, the sprawling Beverly Hills estates looked like pure Hollywood fantasy. Sweeping driveways, marble fountains, and manicured gardens where the stars posed for magazine spreads. But for the mob, these homes weren't just status symbols. They were perfect cover for business that couldn't be done in the open. Some of the most opulent mansions doubled as private negotiation rooms, high-stakes gambling dens, or even makeshift counting houses for stacks of cash coming in from Vegas and the East Coast. Guests might think they were arriving for a champagne-soaked party hosted by a famous actor, but upstairs, behind a locked study door, a very different kind of meeting was happening. One where film distribution deals and loan shark repayments were discussed in whispers. Certain properties were strategically purchased under the names of up-and-coming actors or producers with little real experience. These were often fronts, giving mobsters a legitimate reason to mingle with studio executives, directors, and other influential figures. If anyone started asking too many questions, the explanation was simple. It's a producer's house. We're talking about a new project. No one wanted to risk being blacklisted by prying too much. The layout of these estates made them ideal for secrecy. Long, winding driveways kept unwanted eyes away, while private back entrances allowed for guests to arrive and leave unseen. Some even had hidden rooms or converted basements for safekeeping ledgers, cash, or contraband. And if a meeting ever went south, the sprawling grounds provided more than enough space to ensure that a problem disappeared before the neighbors caught on. The mob also took advantage of Beverly Hills' culture of exclusivity. In a neighborhood where privacy was valued above all else, suspicious comings and goings were often ignored, even by fellow celebrities. The assumption was that whatever was happening behind those gates was just Hollywood business. But this veil of glamour and secrecy did more than protect the mob's operations. It gave them the perfect stage to blur the lines between legitimate entertainment moguls and underworld kingpins. And soon, those blurred lines would pull some of Hollywood's most powerful players into arrangements they could never walk away from. While the mob's men handled the high-stakes deals behind closed doors, it was often the women of Hollywood, young, beautiful, and eager for their big break, who became the perfect public-facing distractions. These starlets, often just starting out in the industry, were invited to glamorous dinners, late-night parties, or weekend getaways at those Beverly Hills mansions. On the surface, it looked like harmless mingling with influential producers and industry bigwigs. But for the mob, these introductions served a deeper purpose. A rising actress on the arm of a known mob associate helped soften the image of a man whose reputation might otherwise scare off legitimate investors. She could charm studio executives, disarm gossip columnists, and make the social scene appear just another extension of Hollywood's excess, rather than a criminal operation in disguise. Some of these women had no idea who they were really keeping company with. They were told they were networking, that these men were financiers or private backers with a passion for the arts. Others knew exactly what they were getting into and used it to their advantage, securing roles, endorsements, or even entire film deals thanks to the connections they built at these gatherings. The mob was smart enough not to involve these women directly in the business. Instead, they were social currency, the kind that bought trust, eased negotiations, and kept the Hollywood rumor mill spinning in directions that benefited the underworld. And when whispers did start to circulate, they were often dismissed as salacious gossip rather than serious allegations. This symbiotic relationship blurred the lines between Hollywood romance and criminal strategy. To the public, it was just another glamorous love affair. To the mob, it was another chess piece in a long game of influence and control. But while these starlets may have helped the mob blend into Beverly Hills society, the men pulling the strings knew that the real power came from controlling not just the faces on the screen, but the people deciding which faces got there in the first place. and that's where their influence began to seep deep into the studios themselves. By the late 1940s and into the 1950s, the mob's reach in Beverly Hills wasn't just about lavish homes and social clout. It had penetrated the very core of the film industry. Through a mix of intimidation, strategic investments, and well-placed intermediaries, organized crime found ways into the studio boardrooms, where the real power in Hollywood was exercised. Many studio heads were already under immense pressure. The collapse of the old studio system, antitrust rulings, and rising production costs made outside funding increasingly attractive. That's when mob-backed independent investors would swoop in, offering cash to save a production, cover distribution expenses, or bankroll new projects. On paper, it looked like legitimate financing. In reality, it gave the mob a say in casting choices, shooting schedules, and even distribution territories. These deals weren't always made at the boardroom table. Sometimes a friendly poker night at a Beverly Hills mansion would end with a handshake agreement that shifted millions. Other times, a studio executive might find himself subtly reminded, perhaps through a veiled threat or an unsettling chance encounter, of the consequences of walking away from such an offer. Once inside, the mob didn't necessarily need to control an entire studio. Even partial influence over a few key executives could be enough to secure favors, inserting a mob-connected actor into a film, ensuring certain venues got exclusive premieres, or funneling profits into laundering schemes via distribution deals. The real genius was how invisible this influence often was. The public never saw mobsters sitting at the head of the table. They saw well-dressed producers or consultants, whose names rarely made the credits. But behind closed doors, these shadow figures could make or break careers with a single decision. This level of infiltration blurred the line between Hollywood's glittering facade and the gritty realities of organized crime. And as the mob tightened its grip, even the most powerful stars began to realize that their fortunes and their futures were tied to forces they couldn't afford to cross. And for those who thought they could outsmart the system, Beverly Hills would soon show them just how wrong they were. For some Hollywood stars living in Beverly Hills, the mob wasn't an enemy to be feared. It was an ally to be courted. These were actors, singers, and entertainers who understood the value of staying on the right side of power, even if that power came with a criminal shadow. The arrangement was often mutually beneficial. For the mob, having a famous face at a party, premiere, or club opening added legitimacy and drew crowds. For the star, mob connections could open doors to lucrative roles, nightclub contracts, or record deals that might otherwise have gone to someone else. In a business where careers could fizzle overnight, a little insurance from organized crime felt like a smart bet. But this wasn't without its price. Some stars were expected to perform at mob-owned casinos or private events, sometimes for free, other times for fees that were never officially recorded. Others found themselves roped into public appearances meant to distract from legal troubles or business disputes brewing behind the scenes. The relationship could also be dangerous. Rumors circulated about actors who became too friendly with certain bosses, leading to jealousies, affairs, and rivalries that ended in scandal. One whispered story involved a leading man whose fling with a mob boss's girlfriend almost ended in a disappearance, saved only by a last-minute intervention from a studio head who understood the stakes. These double lives created an unspoken code in Beverly Hills. At lavish house parties, stars mingled freely with figures everyone knew had blood on their hands. Yet the champagne still flowed and the jazz bands still played. Publicly, it was all smiles and camera flashes. Privately, there were quiet warnings. Never cross your benefactor, never talk to the press, and never, under any circumstances, forget who really held the power. And while some stars thought they could keep one foot in the Hollywood spotlight and the other in the mob's inner circle, Beverly Hills had a way of showing them that walking that tightrope was a gamble that almost always came due. The true danger, though, was still to come. because the mob wasn't content with influence. They wanted ownership. By the mid-1950s, the mob's presence in Beverly Hills had evolved from whispered deals to outright control. Influence was no longer enough. They wanted a tangible stake in the very heart of Hollywood's power structure, and for them, that meant buying up pieces of the neighborhood itself. This wasn't done through public real estate listings or flashy open houses. Instead, properties changed hands quietly, often using front companies or trusted intermediaries. A mansion might be sold to a well-known producer, only for the paperwork to reveal a shadowy holding company based out of Chicago or Las Vegas. Studio-adjacent office buildings and high-end hotels also became prime targets. Once the mob had ownership, they could decide who stayed, who left, and who owed them favors for their prime address. With these properties came leverage. A star behind on payments for a lavish rental could suddenly find themselves agreeing to a friendly contract clause or making a surprise appearance at a mob-run nightclub. Studio executives might host important meetings in spaces the mob controlled, where conversations could be overheard or recorded without anyone suspecting a thing. The deeper they dug in, the harder it became to untangle legitimate Hollywood wealth from mob-backed investments. Even the most respected business leaders found themselves in social circles where their dinner companion might also be an enforcer or loan shark. The glamour of Beverly Hills' sunlit streets masked a quiet empire being built brick by brick. For those paying attention, the shift was clear. The mob wasn't just using Beverly Hills as a base of operations anymore. They were turning it into their own corporate headquarters, with movie stars as brand ambassadors and studio heads as reluctant partners. But like every empire built in the shadows, it was only a matter of time before someone would try to shine a light on it. And in Beverly Hills, that kind of exposure could be deadly. Every empire has cracks. And for the mob's Beverly Hills operation, those cracks started to show when a handful of insiders decided they'd had enough. A few junior accountants, mid-level studio lawyers, and even a property manager or two began noticing patterns. Payments that didn't match the books, property deeds that linked back to mysterious shell companies, and sudden renovations that coincided with high-profile meetings. Some of these people tried to go through official channels. One young accountant allegedly contacted the IRS after realizing a mansion's declared value was wildly underreported. Another source claims a studio lawyer began keeping a secret file of contracts that tied key Hollywood players to mob-backed business entities. Both of them, and their paper trails, quietly disappeared. The stories that followed became Hollywood ghost tales, a promising career cut short by a random car accident, a sudden relocation overseas, or a public scandal that seemed engineered to destroy credibility. In every case, the message was clear. Speaking up came with a price. Even those who survived often found themselves socially exiled. Beverly Hills' glittering parties became dangerous places for anyone suspected of talking to the wrong people. Friends stopped calling, professional opportunities dried up, and invitations to the all-important studio luncheons never arrived. The fear wasn't just about losing work, it was about losing safety. Behind the scenes, law enforcement faced its own roadblocks. Detectives who dug too deep were abruptly reassigned, and files mysteriously went missing from evidence rooms. Federal investigators suspected corruption within local agencies, but proving it was nearly impossible without a living witness willing to go on record. By the late 1950s, the mob's control over Beverly Hills wasn't just about money or real estate. It was about narrative control. They owned the story, and anyone who tried to change the ending risked becoming a footnote no one dared to read aloud. And yet, in the shadows, a few determined figures were still gathering evidence, waiting for the right moment to make their move. That moment would come, but not without one final shocking act of defiance from the mob. For years, Beverly Hills had been the perfect mask. Palm-lined streets, champagne-soaked galas, and a veneer of untouchable glamour that concealed the machinery of organized crime. But one night in the early 1960s, that illusion cracked wide open. It began at a lavish charity ball held in one of the city's most exclusive mansions, an event meant to raise funds for the arts. Every notable figure in Hollywood was there: studio executives, A-list actors, and the political elite. The press was out in force, snapping photos and scribbling down quotes that painted a picture of elegance and unity. What they didn't know was that in a back room, far from the orchestra and the champagne toasts, a confrontation was unfolding. An ambitious district attorney had quietly secured enough evidence to issue a string of subpoenas targeting some of the city's most powerful figures, including a handful of attendees that night. According to whispers from insiders, the DA sent 2 trusted agents to personally deliver the papers, hoping to catch the recipients off guard before they could destroy records or call in favors. But the mob's network of informants was faster. Before the agents even crossed the marble foyer, the word had spread. Guests began excusing themselves from the dance floor, some slipping away through service entrances, others vanishing into the crowd. The 2 agents managed to serve only a few documents before they were surrounded, not by mob enforcers, but by a wall of smiling celebrities and concerned security who politely escorted them out. By morning, the DA's plan had unraveled. Evidence went missing, witnesses recanted, and the few served subpoenas were tied up in procedural delays until the cases quietly collapsed. Still, rumors of the failed raid spread like wildfire, and for the first time, the public caught a glimpse of just how deep the connections between Hollywood and the underworld ran. The charity ball continued that night as if nothing had happened. Champagne poured, cameras flashed, and the orchestra played on. But for those who knew what had transpired, the air was heavy with the realization that Beverly Hills' golden glow came at a price. And the people paying it were often the ones who tried to break the spell. The empire had survived the scare, but the cracks in the facade were growing, and the mob's grip was about to face challenges even they couldn't predict. In the years following that failed raid, Beverly Hills never fully returned to its old innocence, if it had ever truly been innocent at all. The mob's presence was still there, but the whispers had grown louder, and more people were willing to connect the dots. Studio executives who once boasted about their lavish homes and high-roller friends became quieter, more selective about public appearances. Even some of the biggest stars started keeping their distance, afraid that proximity to the wrong person could sink their careers. The FBI, humiliated by previous failed attempts, doubled down. They began targeting the mob's money trail instead of the men themselves, because if you couldn't put the kingpin in prison, you could choke the empire by cutting off its cash flow. Agents quietly interviewed accountants, bank clerks, and even house staff in Beverly Hills mansions, piecing together how illicit funds were funneled through film productions, real estate ventures, and high society events. And here's the thing, the mob wasn't just laundering money. They were influencing what movies got made, who got cast, and even which stories were allowed to hit the big screen. Projects that might have exposed certain connections mysteriously lost funding. Journalists who got too close suddenly found themselves reassigned or out of work altogether. But the old guard was changing. Younger mobsters, eager for faster profits, were less careful than their predecessors. They flaunted their wealth in ways that drew unwanted attention. Flashy cars, public feuds, and parties that spiraled into chaos. This recklessness began to erode the careful balance that had allowed the empire to thrive for decades. Meanwhile, a new kind of Hollywood power was rising. Television executives and independent filmmakers who weren't tied to the studio mob machine. They didn't play by the same rules, and they didn't owe the same favors. Slowly, opportunities for the mob to exert control began to shrink. Still, the fall didn't happen overnight. The mob adapted, pivoting to new industries while keeping a toehold in Beverly Hills. But the days when they could openly rub elbows with Hollywood royalty without consequence were numbered. The empire had been built on secrecy, influence, and fear. And one by one, those pillars were starting to crumble. The golden age of mobbed-up Beverly Hills was fading, but not without leaving behind a legacy of shadows that still lingered in the city's sunlit streets. By the time the mob's influence had mostly slipped from Beverly Hills, the city's public image was still pristine. Palm-lined streets, glittering mansions, and the sense that this was the safest, most glamorous place in America to live. But those who had been there during the height of the mob's reign knew better. The beauty was real, but so was the darkness that had once lurked behind those ivy-covered gates. Many of the mansions that had hosted backroom deals and untraceable cash exchanges still stood, bought and sold by new owners who had no idea of their home's past, or maybe preferred not to ask too many questions. Some of the old properties were quietly demolished, replaced by ultra-modern glass palaces, as if erasing the architecture could erase the history. But a few relics remained untouched, their walls holding secrets no one dared to speak out loud. For those who lived through it, the memories never faded. Retired studio staff whispered to younger relatives about strange visitors who arrived late at night, carrying briefcases instead of scripts. Old producers, long out of the business, spoke cautiously about the projects they were told to greenlight, even if they made no financial sense. Some actors confessed that their careers had been launched or destroyed by forces they never fully understood at the time. Today, the story of Beverly Hills' mob era has taken on an almost mythical quality. It's the kind of tale passed around in hushed tones at industry parties or explored in half-forgotten documentaries. Most of the real players are gone, taking their truths to the grave. But the patterns they set, the way power, money, and influence can quietly shape Hollywood, never really disappeared. Even now, some say you can still feel it. Take a late-night drive past one of the old estates, and you might catch a glimpse of a light flickering in a room that should be empty, or the faint outline of a man in a fedora lingering just beyond the gate. Whether it's memory, imagination, or something more, the shadows of that secret crime empire still stretch across Beverly Hills, reminding anyone who dares to look that the golden age was never as pure as it seemed.